Hello. Welcome again. Welcome again to another Bible Story Children's Time. Today is Tuesday, and we are working our way through a familiar, somewhat familiar anyway, Old Testament story, which has to do with Joseph, son of Jacob. And just to recap very briefly, Joseph was the very youngest son of Jacob. Jacob was the son of Isaac. Isaac was the son of Abraham. So Joseph was considered, later on in history, he was considered a patriarch. But right now, where we're at, Joseph was still a young man, and he had been kidnapped by his brothers and sold into slavery in Egypt. Now, apart from the fact that his brothers hated him, and apart from the fact that he was, to be fair, a bit of a snitch, because he had told Dad what his brothers were up to, Joseph also had a special gift. And the gift had to do with something that happened while he slept. Joseph had prophetic dreams, and he was also able to explain others' dreams and interpret them. And that's plot material, because that's going to come into play in a little bit. So, when the merchants who had bought Joseph got to Egypt, they put him on the market, put him on Craigslist, whatever. Joseph was spotted by a man named Potiphar. Potiphar was an Egyptian. He was the captain of the guard for the Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh was the guy in charge. Basically their king, except they called him Pharaoh. So he had a very important and esteemed position, which was keeping Pharaoh alive, basically. Now, he took a shine to Joseph, so he bought him. And Joseph became a slave in Potiphar's household. And Genesis tells us that the Lord was with Joseph. And the Lord gave him success in everything he did. So as a slave within the household, Joseph was very successful. And Potiphar kept giving him more and more responsibilities. Eventually, Potiphar was so impressed that he put Joseph in charge of his household. And that's no small thing, because that means that the Egyptian captain of the guard for the Pharaoh liked what Joseph was doing so much, and he trusted him so much, that he was willing to put him in charge and entrust him with everything that he owned, which was a lot of stuff. And once again, the Lord was good to Joseph, and he excelled at his job as person in charge of the household of Potiphar. Now, Potiphar had a wife. And eventually that became a problem. Because according to Genesis, aside from the gift of prophetic dreams and interpretation of dreams, Joseph had another problem, or another gift.
I'm too sexy for my love, too sexy for my love, love's going to leave.
Mrs. Potiphar really took a shine to Joseph. And she kept trying to get him to sleep with her. And Joseph, knowing which side of the bread is buttered and who was doing the buttering, said, you know what? Your husband put me in charge of everything he owns. That means he trusts me with everything. I'm not going to betray that trust just so I can sleep with you, Mrs. Potiphar. So thank you very much for the offer, but no. Plus, it would be going against what the Lord would want me to do. She wouldn't take no for an answer. And then one day when Joseph came to Potiphar's house to attend to his duties, he looked around and he noticed, there aren't any other servants here. That seems kind of weird. Like everybody's been sent away or something. And while he was trying to process that and figure out what was going on, because, he had the schedule, he knew what people should be doing, Mrs. Potiphar came up to him and made it really, really clear what she wanted him to do. And Joseph, being a man of great judgment, ran far and fast. He ran from Mrs. Potiphar, like his tail was on fire. The only problem is, in leaving so fast, Mrs. Potiphar grabbed his cloak and tore it off him. I mean, he just tore his way out of that because he wanted out of there. And she held on to the cloak. And then when Potiphar came back, she showed him the cloak and said, you know that guy you hired to watch over everything? Well, he was watching over me a little too closely. And he tried to, and I screamed. And I think he heard some of the other servants. But before he ran away, I was able to grab this cloak. And she showed him the cloak as evidence of what he had done. Now, Potiphar, being captain of the guard and a powerful man, was not happy. And he heard his wife tell this story, and he immediately, because she had evidence, he immediately believed her. So he had Joseph thrown out of his house, and worse than that, he had him thrown into prison. No trial. That was not something they did. So Joseph was just carted off to prison, turned over to the warden and said, here, do what you want. So, after Joseph had been in prison a little while, and this was the prison where all of the king's prisoners were kept, all of the Pharaoh's prisoners. After he had been in there a while, the warden noticed how well he conducted himself. And possibly he had heard or been told that Joseph had run Potiphar's household for a while. And he started putting Joseph in charge of things at the prison. Made him what we would call today a trustee. And he began to get more responsibilities within the prison. Eventually, after he had been in prison for some time, 2 new prisoners were added at the same time. One was the Pharaoh's cupbearer, and the other one was the baker of the Pharaoh. Now, the baker we can understand. He's the guy that baked bread and, whatever else got baked in those days. The cupbearer is not a position that we're used to hearing today, but the cupbearer was literally the guy that handed the Pharaoh his food. So he was a personal servant, but he was also, if you think of the president and Secret Service, the protective detail, if they had somebody that fed the president or handed the president his food, that would have been the cupbearer. Because not only was he responsible for serving the Pharaoh, he was responsible for keeping Pharaoh safe, not poisoned by the food. The fact that they're both put in at the same time leads some commentators to think that something had gone horribly wrong and the Pharaoh had gotten ill and both of these guys had been blamed, but that's not specified in the passage that we're reading. And this is all from chapter 39 and 40 of Genesis. So, now we have the cupbearer, we have the baker, and we have Joseph. And after they've been in prison together for a while, the cupbearer and the baker each have dreams on the same night. And each dream had a meaning of its own. But they didn't know what it was. So they could recognize, this must be a prophetic dream, but gosh, I'm too dumb to understand what it means. So when Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that both of them were dejected and said, guys, what's the problem? Why the long face? And they answered and they said, we both had dreams last night, but there's no one to interpret them. And Joseph said, hey, today's your lucky day. That happens to be my specialty. Don't interpretations belong to God? Well, I'm a godly man, so tell me your dreams. So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream first. He said to Joseph, in my dream I saw this vine growing in front of me. And on the vine there were 3 branches. And as soon as it budded, it blossomed, and the clusters ripened into grapes. And Pharaoh's cup, all of a sudden, Pharaoh's cup was in my hand again. And it just felt so familiar. And I took the grapes and I squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup. And I put the cup in his hand, just like the old days. And Joseph thought for a minute and he said, okay, I think I got this one. The 3 branches are 3 days. So what your dream means is that within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift you up and restore you to your position. And you will put the cup in Pharaoh's hand, just as you used to do, and just as you dreamed. That's good news. And when everything goes the way I say it will, and you're released from prison, I ask you to remember my kindness to you. Mention me to Pharaoh and see if you can, get me out of here. Can you do that? After all, I was kidnapped back in Canaan, and I was sold into slavery here, and then I was falsely accused, and you know me, dude. I've done nothing to deserve this. So when you're free, just remember me and mention me to Pharaoh. And then he turned to the baker and said, okay, what's your story? And the baker said, well, I too had a dream. I was carrying on my head 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket, there were all kinds of baked goods that I had made for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket as I walked. Joseph thought about this one. And he said, well, I'm going to tell you what it means, dude. The 3 baskets are 3 days. And immediately the baker perked up, because he'd heard what Joseph had told the cupbearer. Then Joseph went on. Within 3 days, the Pharaoh will call you up out of prison. And the baker went, yeah. And then Joseph added, and he's going to cut off your head and have your body impaled on a stake. And the birds eating the baked goods, those are birds eating your flesh. Now, that was a major downer. So you had the cupbearer happy, you had the baker very unhappy. And sure enough, after 3 days, it was a special holiday. Possibly it was Pharaoh's birthday, which is what it literally says here in the text. Commentaries say Egyptians didn't really celebrate birthdays, but what Pharaoh would celebrate was his anniversary of becoming Pharaoh. So it could have been the Pharaoh's anniversary of taking office. But whatever, in 3 days, it was a special day. And he gave a feast for all of his officials. He threw a barbecue. And he lifted both the cupbearer and the chief baker out of prison in the presence of his officials. And he gave the cupbearer his job back and said, hey, dude, all is forgiven. You've got your job back. And then to the baker he said, you're not forgiven. We're taking your head. And he did, just as Joseph had interpreted from the dream. So, the cupbearer was freed, the baker was dead, and Joseph was still stuck in prison. Now you remember, he had said to the cupbearer, remember me when you go back to Pharaoh. Put in a good word for me. But you know what? In all of his excitement to get his job back, cupbearer forgot to say anything. And Joseph languished in prison. And that's where we're going to leave the story today. Because after a while, something else happened that would change his life tremendously. But we'll have to wait till tomorrow to hear what it was. Until then, have a great afternoon and stay healthy.